Hampton Court Palace is one of the most famous buildings in Britain. Located in the borough of Richmond upon Thames, 12 miles upstream from central London, this royal palace is inextricably linked to King Henry VIII, one of the most famous yet terrifying of English monarchs. All 6 of his queens lived here at some point, as well as his 3 children. The palace continued as a home to 10 monarchs after Henry's death. This was the palace for parties, feasting, hunting and jousting. It was designed for royal pleasure, to impress powerful visitors and to wow with its flamboyant decor. The palace has a long history, some grand and good, but some extremely tragic and unfortunate. Its walls have witnessed death, disease, scandal, betrayal, love and excess. But it seems there are residents who refuse to leave, who still roam the opulent corridors and palatial rooms of this architectural masterpiece. Ghosts have been seen, heard and felt here for centuries, not just within the palace, but also in its extensive grounds. Welcome to the Ghosts of Hampton Court Palace. An earlier manor house was built on this land sometime before 1338. This was built for the Knights Hospitallers of St. John, who farmed the land to provide funds for the Crusaders in the Holy Land. In 1494, one of Henry VII's senior courtiers, Giles Daubeny, leased the estate and began to make significant improvements to the manor, including the Great Kitchen, which remains today. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey obtained it on a 99-year lease in 1514. He was Henry VIII's chief minister, advisor, Archbishop of York at that time, and one of Henry's favourites. He was a dominant politician and church figure who'd risen quickly from humble beginnings to become one of the country's richest and most powerful men. He began spending lavishly, transforming the manor house into a huge palace complex for himself. Wolsey built the palace to reflect his prestige, to impress the whole of Europe, to entertain the king and receive foreign dignitaries. But Wolsey's golden touch and success at court was not to last. His downfall was due to the political scandal that became known as the King's Great Matter. By the mid-1520s, King Henry VIII had grown unhappy in his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. She had, by then, borne him at least 6 children, with only Princess Mary surviving infancy. Henry longed for a male heir to secure the future succession of the crown. He sought a divorce from Catherine so that he might marry Anne Boleyn, a beautiful young lady of the court with whom he had fallen in love. Wolsey opposed the divorce and fell foul of the king's new mistress himself. This was the beginning of the end for Wolsey, and in September 1528, Wolsey received a letter ordering him to vacate the palace in 4 days' time. Henry had decided to make Hampton Court his own. It was clear that the Pope would not grant Henry a dispensation to divorce Catherine. Rather than submit to the wishes of Rome, and despite the many failed efforts by Wolsey and others to pressure the Pope, Henry chose to sidestep established canonical procedure. This incident led to Henry's decision to separate the Church of England from that of Rome, with himself at its head. Wolsey himself became the first victim of the king's anger, losing his office as Chancellor in August 1529 because he had failed in his negotiations with Rome. It was rumoured that Anne Boleyn and her faction convinced Henry that Wolsey was deliberately slowing proceedings. Wolsey was arrested on the 4th of November, 1529, accused of high treason. He fell ill with dysentery and died en route from York to London on the 29th of November, 1530, sparing him a date with the executioner. But it seems Cardinal Wolsey's ghost still makes an appearance at his former opulent palace. Just off Clock Court is an exhibition named The Tudor World. In this area are the Wolsey Rooms, a Tudor suite of apartments constructed by Wolsey for Henry VIII. This is an area of Hampton Court Palace that visitors often miss. A spiral staircase leads up to the Wolsey Rooms, likely to be where Wolsey resided when the palace was under his ownership. The Wolsey Rooms are home to beautiful panelling, fireplaces, extraordinary artwork, and elaborate ceilings. And also, it seems, several ghosts. Footsteps are often heard on the staircase and on the wooden floorboards when there are very few visitors in the rooms. Is this Wolsey inspecting his beautiful residence? Strangely, the apparition of a large dog is also seen sleeping in front of a fireplace in these rooms. Could this be one of the Tudor hunting dogs from centuries ago? But the apparition of Wolsey has been seen elsewhere in the palace. In 1966, during a Son et Lumière performance at Hampton Court, a number of viewers saw the figure of Cardinal Wolsey under a nearby archway. The audience assumed this was an actor, perhaps linked to the show, but it wasn't. He was witnessed wearing his scarlet cardinal robes, made of the richest materials and cut according to the patterns from Rome, and around his neck he wore a stole of finest sables. Christopher Eade, the producer of the show, was unable to give an explanation for this figure. Stories persist today that at least 2 of Henry VIII's queens haunt Hampton Court Palace. His beloved third queen, Jane Seymour, who died at Hampton Court after giving birth in 1537, and most famously, his fifth queen, Katherine Howard, executed in 1542. But it seems the apparition of Anne Boleyn also makes an occasional appearance at Hampton Court. Anne came from a wealthy and powerful family. Her father was Sir Thomas Boleyn, later the Earl of Wiltshire and the English ambassador to France. She was educated at the sophisticated French court, where she became well-read, a fluent French speaker with a passion for poetry and music. She returned to England in the early 1520s and lived at Henry's court as a lady-in-waiting for Catherine of Aragon. With her striking looks, intelligence and wit, she drew many admirers, including the king, who was captivated by her sophistication, singing and dancing at court. Henry was desperate for Anne to be his wife, and he embarked on the process of breaking from his first wife, despite protests and dismay by many of his courtiers. But Henry and Anne married on the 25th of January 1533 in a private ceremony in London. Henry was elated. By the spring of 1536, Anne Boleyn had been unable to provide Henry with a son and heir. After only 3 years and 3 months of marriage, it's likely that Henry turned his attention to Jane Seymour, believing her to be new wife material. Encouraged by his powerful advisers, including his chief minister Thomas Cromwell, who'd clashed with the Queen herself, the king was determined to get rid of Anne. An excuse was found to accuse Anne of adultery, incest and treason, and she was arrested on May the 2nd. She was subjected to questioning before a sham trial in the Great Hall at the Tower of London, entirely engineered to gain the king's favour. The outcome was inevitable. Anne was sentenced to death. She was executed at the Tower of London on May the 19th, 1536. She walked calmly to the scaffold. After being blindfolded, an expert swordsman who'd been sent before Anne's trial had taken place carried out his task. Her body was interred in the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula. The ghost of Anne Boleyn has been seen on rare occasions at Hampton Court Palace. Her apparition is recognisable from a portrait that hangs in the palace itself. She wears the same dress, which shimmers in the soft light of the afternoon sun, and she glides silently along the corridors she must have known as Queen. Servants at the palace in the late 19th century reported seeing Anne wandering, looking sad and forlorn, among the rooms she once called home. Jane Seymour was born around 1508 to a family with noble ancestry. Her father was a soldier and courtier, Sir John Seymour of Wolf Hall in Wiltshire. She was educated, not to the standards of Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, but she was able to read and write, speak some French and Latin, enjoyed horse riding, and excelled at needlework. Jane was sent to court in the late 1520s to serve Catherine of Aragon as a lady-in-waiting, a role she shared with Anne Boleyn. But in 1531, Henry banished Catherine and removed her household, leaving Jane at a loss. In 1535, Henry and his new wife, Anne Boleyn, visited Wolf Hall on a royal progress, and it was decided that Jane could serve Anne Boleyn at court. Shortly afterwards, Henry became enchanted by Jane, and very quickly he began to shower her with gifts. By 1536, she was publicly the king's other woman. Just 11 days after the death of Anne Boleyn, Henry and Jane were married at Whitehall Palace on the 30th of May, 1536. As a wedding gift, he granted her 104 manors in 4 counties, as well as a number of forests and hunting chases, plus an income to support her during their marriage. Shortly afterwards, she was proclaimed queen, but she was never crowned, as the plague in London was so severe at that time. Jane was a more reserved queen than Boleyn. Ambassador Chapuis, observing Jane at court, was sure she was being coached in manners and etiquette. He wrote, "The Seymour woman is not a woman of great wit, but she may have good understanding." In February 1537, Jane became pregnant. Just after 2 o'clock in the morning, on St. Edward's Day, October the 12th, after 3 days of agonising labour, Henry finally got what he wanted, a healthy son named Edward. His desperate wait of nearly 30 years for a male heir was over. The celebrations began. 2,000 rounds of ammunition were fired at the Tower of London, bonfires were lit, and church bells rang across the nation. Only 3 days later, Prince Edward VI was christened at the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court, with Prince Edward being named after Edward the Confessor. But shortly after the christening, Queen Jane became ill. Despite medical intervention, she deteriorated and she died at Hampton Court just before midnight on the 24th of October. Henry was devastated and said, "Divine Providence has mingled my joy with bitterness of the death of her who brought me to this happiness." Although delighted with his male heir, the king was distraught at the sudden loss of his perfect queen. Her heart was buried in the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court, and her remains were laid to rest at St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. She was joined by her husband after his death in 1547. Possibly the saddest apparition at Hampton Court is that of Jane Seymour. Her ghost is seen dressed in white, gliding silently, carrying a lighted taper. She emerges from Catherine of Aragon's rooms in the Queen's old apartments before moving across Clock Court. She also haunts rooms close to the Cumberland Suite, particularly around apartment 33, where Jane gave birth to her son and also took her final breath. The room today is used to house costumes for the guides, but this room is said to be paranormally active. Close by are the Silver Stick Stairs, where she appears at night on the 12th of October, the anniversary of the birth of her son. She has startled members of staff who repeatedly describe her as a tall lady clad in white with a long train and a shining face. She glides down the stairs, through closed doors, holding her candle, which has a flame that never flickers. The most famous and terrifying ghost at Hampton Court is the ghost of Queen Katherine Howard. But why does Henry VIII's fifth wife haunt this beautiful palace? Is it because she loves it so much? Does she return to a place that made her happy? Sadly, it's for a rather different reason. November the 2nd, 1541, All Souls' Day, marked the beginning of the end for Queen Katherine Howard. Katherine Howard was the niece of Thomas Howard, the 3rd Duke of Norfolk, and the first cousin of the late Queen Anne Boleyn. Katherine Howard, a vivacious and experienced teenager, came from an ambitious family. They were delighted when she gained a place at court as a lady-in-waiting to the new Queen, Anne of Cleves. Her relatives were even happier to discover the king was clearly attracted to Katherine and hoped she would become his mistress, with all the benefits that would be bestowed upon her and her family. But it seems nobody realised the danger they were putting her in, least of all Katherine, by whitewashing her past and presenting her as a maiden to attract the ageing king. Thought to be aged 17, she married Henry VIII, aged 49, on the 28th of July 1540, following the annulment of his marriage of 6 months to Anne of Cleves. Henry was revitalised by his new bride, and it appears that Katherine was happy at first. However, the ageing king had an array of health problems by this time and was an erratic lover, despite her seductive charms. Ultimately, a time came soon into the marriage when, despite the gifts and jewels, Katherine became frustrated, being stuck with an old and infirm husband. During a relapse of his ghastly leg ulcers, when he didn't want to be seen by Katherine, she became close to a previous admirer, Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber. It seems both longed for excitement, but neither knew the terrible risks they were taking. In the summer of 1541, Henry and his queen toured the north of England. Culpeper was among the royal party, and the pair met secretly at a number of locations. The king was oblivious, but others at court were far more observant. Occasionally, people who claimed to have witnessed her earlier behaviour whilst she lived at Lambeth contacted Katherine for favours in return for their silence, and some of these acquaintances were successful. Katherine's former lover, Francis Derham, contacted the Queen for favours, and unwisely, she appointed him as her personal secretary. John Lascelles approached the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, telling him that his sister Mary refused to become a part of Queen Catherine's household, stating that she had witnessed the light ways of Queen Catherine while they were living together at Lambeth. Cranmer then interrogated Mary Lascelles, who alleged that Catherine had questionable relationships whilst under the Duchess of Norfolk's care before she came to court. Eventually, Thomas Cranmer had the unenviable task of telling Henry the truth. He left a letter detailing the charges on the King's seat in the royal pew at the Chapel Royal to give him time and privacy to absorb the devastating news after prayers. At first, Henry shrugged it off, but he ordered an investigation nonetheless. It was in this room at Hampton Court that Henry's council met to discuss tactics. Outraged and upset, Henry VIII left Hampton Court Palace, and Catherine never saw her husband again. On the 6th of November, the Archbishop of Canterbury, along with 4 other council members, confronted Catherine in the Great Watching Chamber, with the allegations against her. Catherine denied everything and refused to be drawn into a discussion about the matter. But the following day, Catherine broke down when questioned by Thomas Cranmer. She tearfully admitted her premarital relationship with Derham, begging the king's forgiveness. She said that Francis Derham had used her in such sort as a man doth use his wife many and sundry times. Catherine also admitted having liaisons with Henry Manox, her music teacher, when she lived with her father's stepmother, Agnes Tilney, Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, at Chesworth House near Horsham, Sussex, and at Norfolk House, Lambeth in London. She later confessed to a relationship with Thomas Culpeper. Catherine had all her jewellery seized, her household dismissed, and became confined to her chambers, under house arrest, with guards outside of her door. On hearing this, Henry was inclined to be merciful until, under torture, Derham admitted having relations with Catherine before she was queen, but stated that he had not had relations with her after she became queen. Derham also revealed that Thomas Culpeper had succeeded him in the Queen's affections. On the 1st of December, both Derham and Culpeper were convicted of high treason against the King's Majesty and misdemeanour with the Queen. Both were executed shortly afterwards at the Tyburn Tree. Catherine's fate was sealed. Catherine and her lady-in-waiting, Lady Rochford, were condemned under a bill of attainder on the 21st of January, 1542. The 1534 Treasons Act stated that a person was guilty of high treason if they did maliciously wish, will, desire, practice, or attempt any bodily harm to be done or committed to the King's most royal person, the Queen, or the heirs. Catherine's apparent intention was enough to condemn her. Catherine and Lady Rochford were convicted without trial. The only person who could save Catherine was the King, who she believed was still at Hampton Court at this time. It is said that at some point during house arrest, Katherine managed to break free from her guards, and she came running along this corridor, the Long Gallery, which runs alongside the Chapel Royal. She got to the large door, the entrance to the royal pew, believing Henry was at prayer on the other side. She hammered on the door frantically and cried out for mercy, begging for her husband to see her. She screamed for Henry and got no reply. The guards grabbed her, shrieking, sobbing for mercy, and dragged her back down the gallery to her chambers. She would only leave Hampton Court one more time to head to Sion House before heading to that sinister fortress, the Tower of London. On the 10th of February 1542, Katherine, dressed in black velvet, was removed from Sion House and after some difficulty and resistance put into a barge to be taken to the Tower of London. As she travelled under London Bridge, she saw Derham and Culpeper's heads on pikes. Katherine was executed on Monday the 13th of February 1542 within the Tower. Unlike her cousin Anne Boleyn, who was executed by sword, Katherine and Lady Rochford were executed by axe. She is thought to have been around 20 when she died, but it is said that her ghost returns to Hampton Court, a palace she called home during her marriage to Henry. Katherine's ghost has haunted and frightened people at the palace since her death. Paranormal investigators and ghost enthusiasts are particularly fascinated by the spooky phenomena associated with the former queen. Katherine's ghost is arguably the most famous ghost at Hampton Court Palace. It is said that since her execution, her wild flight through the Long Gallery, seeking Henry in the Chapel Royal, has been reenacted, accompanied by frantic shrieking and sobbing described as unearthly as the guards pulled her back one last time. Many later residents heard these ghastly screams, and some have witnessed the figure in white, with long hair loose upon its shoulders as it glides at speed through the gallery. The apparition disappears very quickly, leaving witnesses confused as to what they have seen. She was witnessed by Mrs. Cavendish Boyle in the late 19th century, who lived in a Grace and Favour apartment adjacent to the haunted gallery until her death in 1902. She told author Ernest Law that she was awakened out of a profound sleep one night by a loud and unearthly shriek from the direction of the gallery, followed by perfect stillness. She did not mention the occurrences, not wishing to cause alarm or to lend encouragement to the idea that the palace was haunted. Sometime afterwards, however, Lady Eastlake, who had stayed at the palace several times, told Mrs. Boyle that on a previous visit she was startled by a piercing shriek in the same place and also in the dead of night. At this time, the gallery was not open to the public and served as a storage area for furniture and pictures. It was open to the public in 1918, and the Office of Works had the gallery cleared and renovated. Mice and rats had made this abandoned area of the palace their home. Could this explain the shrieking noises in the night? Law describes the apparition as follows. A tall figure, dressed from head to foot in white, has been seen going towards the royal pew, and on reaching the door, has rushed back with disordered garments, a look of despair on her face, and uttering at the same time a succession of the most unearthly shrieks, till she passes through the doorway leading to the Queen's staircase. Many palace visitors have fainted in the haunted gallery, overcome with emotion. Other visitors have reported an eerie presence, a drop in temperature, and having their hair pulled. In 1999, on 2 separate occasions, 2 female visitors fainted under the same chandelier in the Long Gallery. Sometimes service dogs do not like the haunted gallery area. On one occasion, the late Queen Elizabeth II was due to visit. A highly trained sniffer dog and handler arrived to check the area, and the dog completely refused to go into the gallery. Despite the handler's best efforts, the dog lay on the floor, crying and whimpering. Unusual behaviour from such a skilled animal. Perhaps he could sense some sort of presence invisible to the human eye. Another of Hampton Court's resident ghosts is the Grey Lady, who appears in a number of locations. She is believed to be the ghost of Sybil Penn, who played an important role in Henry VIII's household and lived at the palace for many years. In the southwest wing of the palace is apartment 39. Today it is used largely for office and storage space and is generally not open to the public. It was here in the 1830s, when the Ponsonby family were living here in a Grace and Favour apartment, that bizarre goings-on were first recorded. They often heard a whirring noise coming from behind one of the walls, loud crashing noises, and they all heard an elderly woman muttering to herself. The Ponsonbys questioned their sanity, but then they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the landings, roaming through the corridors and walking up and down the staircase. The servants, slightly embarrassed but certainly honest, complained of having strange cold hands pressed against their faces in the middle of the night, startling them and waking them from their sleep. These odd events became rather persistent and were so frequent that in the mid-19th century, a major renovation was undertaken in apartment 39. The Board of Works came into the apartment and found a bricked-up doorway. They removed the bricks one by one from the door within the turret, and they made a staggering discovery. They found a forgotten hidden chamber, and that chamber contained a 16th century spinning wheel and some other personal possessions. The Ponsonbys and the palace staff were convinced this must be the source of the strange whirring noises that had puzzled the family on numerous nights. The residents believed this must be the spinning wheel of Dame Sybil Penn. It was Queen Elizabeth I who granted her a pension and an apartment at Hampton Court. Dame Sybil Penn began her employment under Henry VIII in 1538, initially to be the dry nurse and teacher for his much longed-for son, Prince Edward. She was a highly respected member of Henry's staff, and when she was nurse to Prince Edward, according to family tradition, Henry VIII gave her valuable pearl jewellery, which survives to this day. Her roles at court progressed, and she also became Lady of the Bedchamber to his sisters, Mary I and Elizabeth I of England. She actually served all three of Henry's children in turn. Her final role was particularly important. She became an extraordinary gentlewoman of the Privy Chamber to Queen Elizabeth I. She must have had a fascinating insight into the Tudor court. On the 10th of October 1562, the 29-year-old Queen Elizabeth I fell suddenly and dangerously ill at Hampton Court Palace. Her courtiers were thrown into absolute panic. Initially, it was thought that the Queen had caught a bad cold, but when she developed a violent fever, it became clear that it was something more serious. England had lost several of its Tudor monarchs prematurely. Elizabeth was the last of Henry VIII's children to survive, but she had no clear successor. If the young Queen Elizabeth died, it could be the end of the dynasty. The Queen did whatever she could to keep her symptoms down. She took a bath to ease her aching limbs and attempt to drive out the fever. The following day, Elizabeth and her court heard the dreaded news from her physician. She was suffering from smallpox, one of the deadliest and most feared diseases at that time. Those who survived it were often left hideously disfigured, with scars and even blindness. Elizabeth's health declined rapidly. She was restricted to her apartments, and the court genuinely believed she would die from the disease. The Spanish ambassador reported that Elizabeth was in great danger. If the Queen die, it will be very soon, within a few days at latest. Many of the courtiers accepted the fact that the Queen was likely to die and began the mourning process. There was little hope left. Fortunately, the Queen's ladies managed to nurse her back to health and she recovered, but Dame Sybil Penn was not so lucky. She contracted the disease from the Queen and died at Hampton Court Palace on the 6th of November, 1562. Palace records show that her corpse was immediately removed from the palace and she was buried at St Mary's Parish Church, Hampton. A fine monument was installed, consisting of a recumbent life-size effigy of her under a marble canopy supported on pillars. But the church was struck by lightning in 1829 and it was pulled down and rebuilt. Sybil's monument was moved and, according to some contemporary reports, the tomb was irreverently disturbed and her remains scattered. It was immediately after this that the Ponsonbys reported the mysterious events. In the 1880s, Princess Frederica of Hanover was living as a Grace and Favour resident in apartment 39 in the southwest wing. She had given birth to a baby daughter at Hampton Court in March 1881. A few days after the birth, she entered the nursery. She observed an old woman dressed in grey leaning over her baby's cradle. Believing that this was an intruder, she immediately shouted for help. A servant came running, but the old woman had disappeared. It was less than 2 weeks after this encounter that Princess Frederica's baby daughter passed away. She described the apparition as a tall, gaunt figure dressed in a long grey robe with a hood on her head and her lanky fingers outstretched before her. During World War II, Jane Craig was staying with her grandparents in apartment 39 when she had an encounter with the lady in grey on the staircase. She describes her as being of medium height, completely covered in heavy drab garments, with a trailing veil which reached down to her fingers. Fairly recently, a member of staff when ascending the staircase met the grey lady on one of the landings. She said she appeared completely solid, but the woman vanished in front of her. A sentry on duty outside of the apartment saw a female figure clad in a long grey robe and hood emerging from the former rooms of Sybil Penn. The figure disappeared in front of him, and another sentry witnessed an old woman in grey walk through a stone wall. Both agreed the figure looked like the stone effigy of Sybil Penn. Another witness of the Grey Lady was Lady Maud, who lived at the palace between 1920 and 1942. She was preparing to receive guests when a tall lady in a floor-length grey dress entered the room. Initially, Lady Maud assumed this was a housekeeper or a servant and requested that she switch on the lights to create ambience. There was no reply from the gaunt lady, who simply glided through a closed wooden door. But Sybil Penn's apparition has been seen outside of the palace walls too. Just a few years ago, a member of staff came face to face with her on a moat bridge. They stared at each other for a fraction of a second, which felt like an eternity, before the ghost walked off across the bridge and down towards apartment 39, and then off towards the River Thames. Is this the mysterious woman who appeared one midsummer night to anglers and those working in the river's landing stages? Those who have seen Sybil Penn say she comes across as very gentle and kind. Perhaps she is still in her role of a nursemaid, hence the touching of the forehead and leaning over the baby's cradle. Perhaps she's trying to protect residents and warn them when they may not be well. Lady Hildyard, residing in a Grace and Favour apartment, desperately wanted to move from her home overlooking Fountain Court. But she had a battle on her hands, and records exist of her complaint to the palace authorities. She resided on the west side of Fountain Court, that grand space of Sir Christopher Wren's, with its beautiful fountain and manicured gardens. But why would a resident be unhappy with this idyllic pocket of Hampton Court? It seems Lady Hildyard had begun to receive more visitors than she planned, 2 more actually, of the spectral variety. She would see 2 men about her apartment and be disturbed by the rapping noises they made. She knew immediately that these mysterious men were not of this world, and wrote to the Board of Works, complaining desperately. They replied back, stating that their jurisdiction did not extend to the afterlife. In 1871, the foundations of the court were excavated to create a new drainage system. This is just opposite the main ladies' toilets today. But our story takes an unexpected turn. Just yards from Lady Hildyard's door, 2 skeletons were discovered under the ground. Exasperated, the lady is recorded as saying, "The stupid Board of Works has at last found the 2 wretched men who I have been telling everyone have been haunting me for years." For a while, stories circulated that these were the mortal remains of 2 cavaliers killed in a skirmish with parliamentarian forces, but this is not the case. The skeletons date back to William and Mary's time at the palace. William and Mary wanted to knock down much of the Tudor palace and were keen for Wren to build the newer Baroque palace. William wanted this done quickly and at minimal cost, and substandard bricks and mortar were used. Unsurprisingly, the structures became unsafe, and at one point the whole of the South Range fell down, injuring 9 and killing 2. Many of the construction workers were European immigrants. It is believed that the master carpenter or foreman was given a substantial amount of money to bury the men, and it is likely he pocketed the money and buried them while the new Fountain Court was being built. After the remains were given a proper burial, the strange sounds and unexplained figures in Fountain Court ceased. In February 1907, a local police officer with 20 years' experience filed a report of an incident at the palace. PC 265T, on duty in the grounds, witnessed what he believed to be a group of people heading towards him along Ditton Walk. As they approached, he could see them laughing and chatting, and yet they were silent, except for the sound of the ladies' long dresses rustling. There were 2 gentlemen and 8 or 9 ladies. He instinctively turned to open the gate for them, but when he turned around, they changed direction and headed towards the flower pot gate. As he watched, the entire group suddenly vanished. He reported, 1 minute they were there, lifelike and completely natural. The next they had completely disappeared. Just who are these mysterious figures wandering through the grounds? I really hope that you enjoyed these stories from Hampton Court Palace. It is an absolutely beautiful place, very, very big grounds, absolutely exquisite. The building is superb. And every time I go there, I discover something new. It's fascinating. I've got some bits and pieces to share with you today, and I was in Hampton Court actually in September, and something a little bit strange happened. I'll talk about that in a moment. But before I do that, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the difference between the execution of Anne Boleyn and Katherine Howard. And the question I wanted to look at was, why was Anne Boleyn executed by a French swordsman brought over specifically, but Katherine Howard was executed by axe, with her head on a block, technically a less honourable death? Some historians believe it was because Anne had spent time in France where nobility were executed by sword. But does the answer really lie more in Henry thinking about himself rather than Anne? Some say Thomas Cromwell was detailed and that the swordsman was ordered before the trial itself, which obviously stinks of injustice, but Cromwell wasn't there to organise Catherine's death because he was actually executed on the day Catherine and Henry married. So Henry's right-hand man who organised things was not there. But on reflection, when I think about this, I really think this is all about Henry's PR for himself. It's all about his image and the image that he projects through his actions. We know that Henry was obsessed with the legends of King Arthur, and in 1516 Henry had the Round Table in the Great Hall of Winchester Castle, believed to date back to Camelot, and he had it painted with the figure of Arthur, but it bears Henry's features with an imperial crown. So here's a picture of the Round Table on the wall at Winchester Castle. And let's have a quick look at the image there. That is what Henry VIII put or wanted depicted on that table. Now, in Malory's Morte d'Arthur, Guinevere was sentenced to death by burning at the stake. But Henry decided Anne would be beheaded with a sword, a true symbol of Camelot. Was this an attempt to make Henry look like a rightful king, that if you're going to execute the Queen, you do it in this formal manner, as the French nobility would do it? We know that Henry enjoyed jousting and all the things that are symbols of chivalry, and perhaps this execution was seen in his eyes as a chivalrous way to go. Is this simply a symbol of Henry's overbearing vanity and self-righteousness, that he wanted to align himself with these powerful, legendary figures? Did he see himself as a legend in that respect? Was it simply too difficult to bring an executioner over in February for Catherine compared to May, weather-wise? Channel crossings in Tudor times were much slower and weather-dependent compared to modern times. Could that have actually been a factor? I don't know. Was it a symbol of respect for Anne, whether genuine or not, and a lack of respect for Catherine? Axe executions often didn't go smoothly, including Cromwell's own execution, and a number of axe executions went terribly wrong. Was it simply the case that Henry knew this and simply didn't care? Was this method deliberately chosen for Catherine because he was so angry and upset with her? My understanding is that when Henry heard about Catherine's behaviour, he said he wanted his sword so he could torture her to death. So maybe that is a factor. What do you think? Incidentally, Catherine was executed first, as her status was higher than her lady-in-waiting, Lady Rochford, despite the many depictions in various dramas of Catherine going second. If you are interested in finding out more about Katherine Howard, I would highly recommend Young, Damned and Fair by Gareth Russell, which is a fascinating book. It's really, really good. I picked up my copy for secondhand, but it's quite a big book, but it's very, very detailed, and I think many of you would really enjoy it. On that note, let's have a look at a postcard that I picked up actually in the gift shop at Hampton Court, and it says, "The Hampton Court Palace Ghost. The ghost of Katherine Howard, wife of Henry VIII, said to be seen at night rushing through the Great Hall. She stops suddenly and, wringing her hands, shrieks despairingly, then returns and disappears at the entrance to the haunted chamber. Now, I'm not aware of the accounts showing that she's wringing her hands. I think we've got a touch of the Lady Macbeths there. And I also find this picture quite interesting, that the executioner ghost has also made an appearance that I am not aware of at all. And on the back of the postcard it says, late 19th century postcard depicting the ghost of Katherine Howard in the Great Hall at Hampton Court. And people really believe these images were true, which I think is quite funny. I'll talk to you now about what happened to me when I went to Hampton Court. I think I went on the last day of September. It was a fairly warm day. It wasn't windy or cold, but I had a jumper on it. I didn't need a coat or anything like that. And this was an incident that happened to me in the wine cellar, which is part of Henry VIII's Tudor kitchens establishment. You go into the wine cellar as you do the audio tour. The audio tour says something like, step to your left and you'll see a set of steps and descend down the steps into the wine cellar. And I'm looking for these steps. I'm thinking, where are these steps? I can't see a thing. It's quite dark in there. And the audio tour is excellent, but I'm looking around, I'm wandering up and down the corridor thinking, how can I miss the steps to the wine cellar? Eventually, I see a couple stepping down a set of steps and I thought, right, they know where they're going, I'll follow them. And down we go into the wine cellar. And at that time, the only people in the wine cellar were the couple in front of me and myself. It was quite quiet. It was really quite a quiet day at Hampton Court when I was there. I was listening to the audio tour, but the couple in front of me were not, and they were kind of walking through fairly quickly, actually. And they got about halfway through the pathway on the right-hand side, and they both stopped, completely stopped in their tracks. And then they did this really strange thing. They sort of started karate chopping the air, both of them, like waving their hand through the air horizontally. And I thought, what are they doing? This is really weird. So I walk up to them because I'm following the same path. And the man speaks to me. And this was really, really bizarre. I take off my headphones and they are still karate chopping the air. And the man says to me, can you feel this? And I looked at him and said, what? And I put my hand out and I started karate chopping the air too. And I just felt like such a weirdo. But my goodness, yes, I could feel it. It was absolutely bizarre. I've never encountered anything like this ever in my entire life. If you look at that picture where you can see the little light on the floor, I think it was somewhere in that area. There was an absolutely freezing, and when I say freezing, I really do mean freezing column of cold air, proper circular column. The cold air wasn't moving. I put my hand in it and I withdrew my hand straight away. I just thought, my goodness, that's absolutely icy cold. The man stood in it, which I thought was, brave. He said it only goes down to my hands. He could feel it on his head. There was no wind with it. It wasn't moving or anything. But it was an absolutely icy column of air, about the size of maybe a large dinner plate in diameter. I stood in it and I could feel it too. And it went down to about my hands. It certainly didn't go down to my feet. And then we sort of stood there and we're all still karate chopping it a bit. And the next thing you know, it seems to have risen and gone up past our shoulders, past our heads, and just vanished. I have absolutely no concept of what on earth that could be. I spoke to 2 guides after this in another part of the palace, and I said, is there air conditioning in the wine cellar? And they said, absolutely not. I don't know whether this was an environmental thing, a weather thing. I cannot tell you rationally what that was, but I was not the only person who experienced. These 2 people were quite startled by it. It was just very odd. I'm not saying it's paranormal, I'm just saying I don't really know how to explain it, and it was really quite unnerving, actually. And it really reminded me of those scenes in Star Trek where they say, beam me up, Scotty, and they've got that sort of cylindrical light thing going on. It was very strange, and a few weeks later, I was doing some research, and I have not found anything about hauntings in the wine cellars, but I did find this rather intriguing photograph, so I thought I'd show it to you. I'm not exactly sure when it was taken, but those are the steps down into the wine cellar. It looks to me like a figure of a boy, maybe, sort of sitting there, leaning over. I think I can make out 2 legs, but it's not terribly clear. What do you think about that weird incident that happened to me? I'm still a bit lost for words over it, if I'm really honest. Let's have a look at some more ghosts caught on camera, maybe. What do you think of this image? I can see something. I'm not certain I can see something very, very clear. Maybe a child? Not really sure on that one. This next one is quite interesting. Can you see that figure on the left by the sort of pushchair? Apparently that figure was not present when the photograph was taken. Do you think that's a man in a Tudor outfit, or do you think it's a real person, some sort of error on the photograph? I'm not sure on that one. Here's a photograph of the King's Stairs. Now, the King's Stairs were William III's staircase. Very grand, very ornate, very opulent. And this is an interesting photograph that somebody took of the King's staircase. And there seems to be a figure of a small child with blonde hair and somebody next to her, maybe an adult wearing a cap of some sort. I think some of these images have been enhanced, as in brightness and contrast adjusted, but I don't know whether they've been digitally enhanced in terms of manipulated. I think it's quite an interesting picture. Apparently there has been the ghost of a little girl seen there several times. So perhaps this person caught not just a ghost on camera, but 2, which is quite special. This next picture is a picture that has been debunked, and it was somebody who claimed that they'd taken a photograph of the lady in grey. But actually, people who know about Apple iPhones have discovered that there is a phenomena or a problem with panorama shots that can create these images quite easily. So I'm afraid it's not the lady in grey. It's actually quite an easy thing to capture these sorts of blended images using iPhones, apparently. Now, the next set of images really did make the headlines back in 2003. I'm going to read you an article called Spook or Fluke, and it says, "This CCTV picture of a ghostly figure captured flinging open a fire door at the palace attracted international media attention in October 2003. The fire doors flew open with great force on 3 consecutive days, with the ghostly figure making his starring appearance on the 2nd. No living soul has ever come forward to admit responsibility, and security staff remain baffled." I really don't know what to make of this one. Some people are sceptical because they think he's wearing shoes, and other people are sceptical because they find it difficult to understand how a Tudor ghost would understand modern fire doors. And I think there are some valid points there, but I'll leave it up to you. Let me know what you think of that in the comments. And these are the actual doors that were flung open in the back of the Tudor World exhibition if you want to go and have a look. Hampton Court Palace does have a wonderful gift shop, and I spent far too much money in there, including this replica Henry VIII coin, which is called a half angel, and it would have been struck at the Tower of London between 1509 and 1526, and the picture shows St. Michael standing on a dragon, about to thrust it into the pit with a lance, with the dragon representing Satan. On the reverse, it shows a ship bearing a royal shield and a cross with H and a rose at the sides. And the Latin reads, "Henry VIII, by the grace of God, King of England and France," on one side, and on the other side there seems to be 2 different translations, but I think they mean roughly the same thing. "Hail thou cross, my only hope," or "By thy cross save us, Christ Redeemer." So I'm not absolutely certain which one of those is correct. These are some stamps that are from 1997, and they are commemorative of Henry VIII and his 6 wives at Hampton Court Palace. One of the things that really struck me when I was at the palace was how amazing and truly extensive their art collection is. You can spend hours and hours wandering through the palace, looking at the paintings. They are magnificent. Also the tapestries. There's a really rich art culture at Hampton Court. It's wonderful. I would like to go there simply to look at the art for a day. I would love that. And finally, I've just got one postcard for you, which is from April 1968, and I had to have this postcard. I just thought it was great. Sorry I haven't written, but I'm really terrible about writing letters. On Monday, I went on a bank holiday ramble with the youth club I belong to. It was great fun. The boys had flower bombs and squeezy bottles filled with water. You should have seen the vicar. He was smothered. I went to Hampton Court yesterday with Mum and my sister. Are you going to come up to London sometime this year? I hope so. Love, Linda. Linda sounds like she might be a bit of a handful, doesn't she? I did find that quite funny. I was not expecting that postcard. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. Well, that's it from me today. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please feel free to like and subscribe. And don't forget to come and find me on Instagram. I'll leave a link in the description box below. Take care, guys, and I'll see you on the next one.